Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is Ukraine. How will this war end? Thank you to our very special guest, Ambassador William B. Taylor, Vice President, Europe and Russia at the United States Institute of Peace, Dr. Kori Schake, Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and David Ignatius, columnist and associate editor at the Washington Post. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Just about a year ago, Russia expanded its war in Ukraine. It launched an invasion intending to seize the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. 8 years earlier, Russia had seized and annexed Crimea, the strategically valuable peninsula that juts into the Black Sea. It had also intervened and occupied part of eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region. But the invasion of February 2022 was a substantially bigger operation. And many of us wondered, did Ukraine have the resources to hold the Russians at bay for a few weeks? Well, a year later, all parties to the war in Ukraine have surprised us. The Ukrainians, by their valor on the battlefield, their unity and their successes, the United States and NATO and other allies for their solidarity and support of Ukraine, and Russia by the sheer depth of its unexpected military incompetence. So how might the war in Ukraine end? With Ukrainian territorial gains that force a Russian withdrawal, or with Russia's thousands of fresh troops reversing their losses, or Russia threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons? Will it end with a diplomatic settlement that leaves parts of Ukraine still under Russian control? Of course, we don't know the answers to these questions, but we've asked a very excellent panel to tell us what they think and what role they think the U.S. should play in all this. Our first panelist is David Ignatius. He's an opinion columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post. When I first met him about 1,000 years ago, he was a Wall Street Journal reporter in Washington, and he went on to be that paper's Middle East correspondent and diplomatic correspondent. He has been at the Washington Post since 1986, and between senior editing jobs and columns, he has managed to write 10 spy novels, including Body of Lies, which was made into a good movie. David, welcome. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Robert, as always.
You were in Ukraine not too long ago. From what you saw and heard there, tell us what the situation is now. Is either side gaining or losing significant amounts of territory?
I was in Ukraine in December, had been there in October and earlier. As of December, I would have described the war as a brutal stalemate. Winter obviously was setting in. The combat continued, especially in the eastern area of the Donbas, with a World War I kind of trench warfare, bitterly contested, but not much advance on either side. This followed a fall of significant Ukrainian gains, Russians on their back foot. we may now be entering a slightly different phase. The Russians do continue through relentless use of artillery, waves of assault troops in this eastern region, especially around the town of Bakhmut, to make advances. And just visiting with people in the White House yesterday, I heard talk of the possibility that Ukrainian line in Bakhmut may break. This shouldn't be confused with a strategic victory. The battle for Bakhmut, let alone this part of Donetsk, is not an existential one, I don't think, for Ukraine, but it will be a psychological victory. Just finally, in addition to the Russian offensive that seems to have begun, both with forces massed on the ground and air power just outside Ukraine, there's talk of a Ukrainian counteroffensive coming, perhaps in the south. One argument for a strategic pullback in the Bakhmut area is to free up troops that would be available for a much more strategically important fight. So that's how I'd sum it up, Robert. The stalemate grinding is a little more fluid now, but I think we'll just have to wait for the next week or two, which could see real changes.
Something very interesting in your reporting was that while the war in Ukraine is on the one hand, it seems sometimes to be a throwback to World War I style trench warfare, there's very much a 21st century side to the Ukrainian effort, and it seems like they are out-teching the Russians. Do I have that right?
They are extraordinarily out-teching the Russians. The subject of my reporting in December from Ukraine was what we call the algorithm war. And the United States and its NATO partners have provided Ukraine with what amounts to an electronic battlefield in terms of the ability to analyze intelligence, immediately update it, and then use it for targeting purposes. The Russians are facing a level of mastery of this electronic battlefield that I don't think any adversary has ever seen. I think the reason that people were comfortable with me writing about this is that there's an important deterrent value in people understanding what the United States can do with satellites, our own national intelligence satellites, but also the thousands of commercial satellites that now ring the planet. You can dial up from Ukraine commercial satellite imagery of Bakhmut, which I did when I was there, or Kherson, or anywhere else. If you want more satellites, you dial in greater coverage from these, 2,500 Starlink satellites fly around the world constantly. So the United States has mastered the ability to use these tools. The Russians have tried and have failed. And this is important, not simply in Ukraine, but as I wrote in the piece, if the Chinese are contemplating an invasion of Taiwan, they ought to look at this technology and think twice, because it's going to be harder than they realize.
David, you interviewed Secretary of State Tony Blinken recently, and one thing that was that I found striking in your account of the interview was that you wrote that both American and Ukrainian officials tend to regard, they may not say this very, very loudly in public, but they seem to regard retaking Crimea by force as probably beyond what Ukraine can get done militarily in this war. Fair?
So that isn't said out loud, even by U.S. officials, except for General Milley, who says it pretty frequently. But I do hear that said often. It's, to me, the point that sensible officials make is that Crimea cannot be a platform for future attacks on Ukraine as it is now. Whatever its status, the reason the Russians should agree to some demilitarized status or limits is if they don't, there's going to be a battle for Crimea, which will be a horrific one. But the political status of Crimea may be deferred. There has been discussion between Ukrainian officials and U.S. officials about how, if you ever got to a negotiated settlement, we're not there yet, but how, if you ever got there, one might think about that. Would you set a date fixed by which the political status would have to be resolved? And the Ukrainians expect that that people of Crimea would want to be part of Ukraine. But I think a military conquest of Crimea at this point, given the forces that Ukraine has, would be, as we remember the phrase, a bridge too far. I'd be curious what the other panelists think about that, but that's my judgment.
As you said, this is right now. We shouldn't expect negotiations at this moment by any means. Do you get any sense of a time frame from either American or Ukrainian officials? Do they assume that there's another war, that there's another year rather, or another 2 years of
so
fighting?
I think there's certainly another year of fighting likely. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is sufficiently exhausted that they don't believe they could get more on the battlefield than they could get in negotiations. A year from now, what that'll look like is hard to predict. One thing I think we can just note is that happily the unity and patience of the NATO alliance in supporting Ukraine remains strong. It's crucial that it remains strong. It's not indefinite. I hope it would continue into 2024. It'd be a big task for people like Ambassador Taylor, who knows so much about this. But you have to worry that a year from now, people might say, we're running out of ammunition, we're running out of patience, time to get this settled. So I think the year for Ukraine to seek the maximum gains possible is this year.
David Ignatius, thanks, and stick around for the question and answer session. Our next panelist is William Taylor, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's now vice president for Europe and Russia at the United States Institute for Peace. Ambassador Taylor was a West Pointer who served as a captain and company commander in Vietnam, where he was decorated for his service. He became a diplomat and served in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, among other posts. He was ambassador in Kyiv during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations, and he returned to Ukraine in 2019 as a chargé d'affaires, the number 2 diplomat at the embassy. Bill Taylor, welcome to our discussion. And before I ask you for your thoughts on how the war in Ukraine might end, I want to hear from you about how important this question is. That is, what do you say to an American who wonders, why do I care whether Ukrainians or Russians control a city called Donetsk, several thousand miles away?
Robert, this is a very good question. It's an important question. Why should we care? Why does it matter to the United States? It matters to us, in my view, because if Russia were to take over Ukraine, that would be the message. That would be the message to the world. That would be the message to other powerful nations that if you have the power, you can take over your neighbor. You can invade your neighbor. The message that would send is that we're back in the jungle. We're back in the laws of the jungle. There's no rules any longer. If a big nation like Russia can invade a smaller nation like Ukraine and get away with it and have this be allowed, have this work for the Russians, that's a terrible message. And it's a terrible message for our East European allies, for the Poles, for the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, soon the Finns, are going to be very concerned that the Russian aggression, the Russian imperial instinct, if you will lead to the Russians moving on them after they have succeeded, if they do, in Ukraine. So it's important that they fail in Ukraine. It's important that Ukraine wins so that our allies, indeed, so our alliance, so the people, the nations that we're obligated to defend, if they're invaded, are secure. That's really the importance, Robert.
So then what constitutes Ukraine winning? What would have to happen for President Zelensky, or for that matter, President Biden, to say that the Ukrainians defeated the Russians in their effort to occupy them?
It's actually very simple. It's very simple. And the Ukrainians have answered this exact question. All they want is for the Russians to get out of their country. Mm-hmm. The Russians invaded, as you've described, on the 24th of February. They invaded earlier in 2014, as you've described, into Crimea and Donbass. All the Ukrainians want to win is for the Russians to get out of their country. So it's that simple.
But it sounds like, from what David was saying about Crimea, for example, that if there is a resolution of this war a year or 2 years from now, it might very likely not include the complete and full withdrawal of Russian troops from all of the territory they've taken. Would a return to the status quo ante, could that qualify as Ukraine having defended itself against Russia trying to take over the whole country?
I don't think so. I don't think so, Robert. I think that there are principles that we're defending, that indeed the Ukrainians are fighting to defend. And those principles include territorial integrity. That's in the UN Charter. Sovereignty is in the UN Charter. If your territory is intact, if you have sovereignty, you're not invaded by your neighbor. And so if your neighbor invades, they need to get out of your country. They restore Ukrainian territorial integrity, restore its sovereignty. That's the win. It's not a win if the Russians can claim some part of Ukraine as their own, which they've tried to do. That's not a win. Now, let me be clear. And I think the Ukrainians have been clear. The Ukrainians don't say that they have to take it all back now. They say that they're going to push militarily the Russians out of their country. And they're doing that, as you've described and as David described. They pushed real hard this fall and pushed the Russians way back. The Ukrainians want to continue to do that, push them out. However, we've all recognized, you've described, and David just described, the difficulty that Crimea presents. The Ukrainians won't give up claim to Crimea. They will not give it up. They have said, however, that part of taking back the territory that the Russians have illegally annexed and now occupy, part of that taking back will be done militarily, as they've shown they can do. Part of it, the Ukrainians have said, may be done diplomatically. And that suggests that at some point there could be diplomacy that addresses Crimea. And it doesn't have to happen all at once. This can happen over time, I think, as David has described. So the goal is clear. The goal is clear. Russians out of Ukraine. The time frame, the mechanism, that's to be determined.
There's been much talk about German Leopard tanks and U.S. Abrams tanks going to Ukraine. Can those weapons change the course of the war anytime soon in a significant way? Absolutely.
They absolutely can. In fact, I would have a shorter time frame option, at least an option, the possibility, a scenario, Robert, that I would put to you and to David Ignatius and Kori, Schake, when she comes on. And that is exactly what you say. The Leopard tanks, of which there are thousands in Europe right now. And the Ukrainians don't want all those thousands. The Ukrainians say they need, a couple of hundred. And if they get there soon, which is also possible, then they can mount an offensive, maybe a counteroffensive, as David has described, but maybe an offensive. If they strike first, they can use that capability, the capability of the Leopards, not just the tanks, though, by the way. It's also the artillery, the long-range artillery, the very precise artillery. And it's also the infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradley fighting vehicles, the strikers that allow the Ukrainians to move their troops around the battlefield very quickly. That combination, tanks, artillery, infantry, ideally with aircraft, they could break through the Russian lines. The Ukrainians could break through the Russian lines, and that could lead to an early end to this war. So it's not a year. That could lead to a war's end in 6 months.
Really? Well, I want to ask you one more question that draws upon your military background also, which is, does the Russian army's performance surprise you? And are its flaws such that they could be corrected by a change of generals and the arrival of new troops?
The performance did surprise me, surprised a lot of us. I think David said the same thing. We thought that the Russian army was the second best army in the world. Turns out it's the second best army in Ukraine. It turns out that they were poorly led. They were poorly prepared. But the big thing, Robert, the big problem, and this gets to your question, can it be fixed? The big problem the Russians have is morale. Mm-hmm. It's not which general is in charge. Putin has tried several, and none has worked out very well. But morale, why is morale? The Russian army doesn't know why they're in Ukraine. They've not been given an explanation. Compare that to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians know exactly why they're fighting. They're fighting for their homes, for their communities, for their oblasts. They're fighting for their country, their land. Robert, they're fighting for their existence. This is existential for the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians lose, there is no Ukraine. There is no Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They know that. That's why they will win. This is why they will win, Robert, in the end.
Yeah. Well, Ambassador Taylor, stick with us because we'll have the Q&A session in a few minutes after we hear from our third panelist, who is Dr. Kori, who I hope has joined us. Dr. Schake is a senior fellow and director of defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, the Washington-based think tank. Her doctorate in government and politics is from the University of Maryland. Dr. Schake has since taught at Maryland, as well as at West Point, at King's College London, and at more universities than I can mention. She has held senior positions at the State Department, the Defense Department, and on the National Security Council. And she was also a foreign policy advisor to John McCain's presidential campaign, as well as being a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Kori Schake, welcome to our panel, and thanks for taking part. First, let me ask you the sort of the big overall title question, which is how do you think the war in Ukraine ends?
It ends with military victory by one side or the other. I don't. Sorry, there's an ambulance going by outside. Seems appropriate given the sponsor of this conversation. Mm-hmm. It's fashionable to say that military force can't solve problems, but in fact, only military force is going to solve this problem. In addition to the reasons that both David and Bill gave for why Ukraine cannot settle for Russia continuing to hold its territory and its people, is the nature of Russian occupation, the war crimes, the separation of 6,000 children to be spirited out of the country to Russian families, that it cannot be tolerable for a political leader, President Zelensky or anybody else, to accept those terms of an outcome. And the Russians don't want to negotiate because they still think they can terrorize the Ukrainians into submission. So what is going to solve this question is performance on the battlefield. I think I am even more bullish than Ambassador Taylor is on Ukrainian prospects. What it looks like to me is the sand is running through the hourglass for the Russians, that in order to, once they realized their war plan was unsuccessful and their military, 80% of their army was sent into Ukraine at the start of the war, was inadequate to the task of achieving their political objectives, they tried to call up 500,000 additional Russian soldiers. They succeeded in only getting 265,000, and 1 million Russians fled the country. That's a cost exchange ratio that's actually not going to make their war effort sustainable. Whereas what Ukraine is looking at is increasing training, support, weapons, financial support from other free societies. So I do think Ukraine's going to be able to muster an offensive that knocks Russia out of its defensive positions, both in the Donbass and in Crimea, before their 2023 is out.
Well, you're definitely the most bullish member of the panel, and in that case, you would not imagine that this could be a Korea-like situation where this could be a conflict that might go on for decades without a formal resolution. No.
No, I don't think so. I don't think Ukrainians will stand for it. And I think, as Ambassador Taylor said, any Ukrainian territory that Russia continues to hold will continue to be contested.
Heard you saying recently that Vladimir Putin might find it less humiliating to lose a war to NATO than to lose a war to Ukraine. And that distinction that you raised brought to mind for me the argument of the writer Christopher Caldwell, who wrote a provocative article in the Washington Post a while ago that I want to ask you about. Here's Caldwell's article, his argument. He says that with the commitment of German and American tanks, the U.S. is, and I'm quoting from him now, the U.S. is replacing Ukraine as Russia's main battlefield adversary. With whom is Russia at war, Ukraine or the United States? It's essentially an argument against what he says as escalation.
That's such nonsense. Russia is losing a war against the Ukrainian military. It would lose a war against the Polish military, the German military, the Dutch military, the British military, and most definitely the American military. But President Biden's concern about potential for escalation has what's led to a slow, incremental increase in assistance to Ukraine. And we are arming one party to a conflict. That's certainly true, because there's a good guy and a bad guy in this conflict. But that is wholly different than the United States going to war against Russia, which the president has been at pains to make clear we are not.
And you faulted the president for speaking, and it also involved the venue where he was speaking with Democratic donors, I believe, about the fear of escalation in Ukraine. How can we ignore the fact that Russia has a nuclear arsenal? Ukraine negotiated away what would have been a huge nuclear arsenal if they'd kept what had been there during Soviet times, and we certainly don't want to see Russia use a tactical nuclear weapon. How should the president play that in a way that doesn't contribute to the deterrent force that nuclear weapons have?
So it is responsible of the president to be concerned about the potential for escalation, either what the military calls horizontal escalation, expanding the war to Poland or Romania or other NATO countries, or vertical escalation, which is going from conventional to nuclear use. But the likelihood of Russia attacking the United States is extraordinarily small. And the way the president talks about it, his saying how worried he is about the potential for World War III, or concern about Russia, we need to leave Russia an exit with honor. Those things actually encourage Russian nuclear blackmail. They encourage nuclear proliferation to other countries, because what it is suggesting is you can prevent the United States from doing what's in its interests if you threaten a very low probability outcome, which the United States is the country that's in a strong position to counter. The way the president talks about it, you would think we were the weak party in this negotiation, as opposed to the strongest and safest party. He keeps conveying what we won't do, what we won't provide to Ukraine, and that gives Russia encouragement that they can establish a ceiling on our assistance and continue to fight. And I think that's a strategic error.
Well, we'll talk about that further with our other panelists shortly. But do you believe that the kind of Ukrainian victory that you can imagine would in fact alter, say, the calculations of, say, the Chinese about Taiwan, or are the situations simply too different for there to be a knock-on effect from the outcome in Ukraine and policies toward that are made in Beijing?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. It seems to me that the lessons I wish the Chinese were learning were the willingness of free societies to band together and assist the good guys to uphold an international order where states have rights and people have rights, and changes to existing borders only occur by consent of both parties. That the United States military, for only 4% of our defense budget this year, is arming the Ukrainians to destroy the Russian army, and that what the Russians are attempting to do is extraordinarily difficult, and it's hard to tell who's good at it before you fight an army. So I wish that's what the Chinese were learning. What I fear they're learning are we're letting lots of countries get around the sanctions on Russia, that we are so fearful of being involved in the war ourselves, we won't send our own troops, and we're very hesitant and slow in the aid we send. I think it's too soon to tell what the Chinese or other aggressors might be learning.
Yes, the question that occurs to me, and I'm just curious what you think about it, is that if I try to see the world as Xi Jinping might, and I would see my country as one that's gotten really good at manufacturing over the past couple of decades and knows how to make things, maybe even military things. Russia remains an extractive economy that still pumps and mines and farms, and we shouldn't be surprised that their trucks break down all the time. In the Soviet Union, that was no surprise. I wonder if China sees itself as being in the same situation as Russia, or being a qualitatively different economy and military.
What I notice about what the Chinese leadership says is that they're actually incredibly racist and condescending about other societies. They think they're different and better. And they may be right, but I do agree with your judgment that they are quite confident that they are different and better than the Russians, than us, than others.
How important is it that Ukraine at the end of this war either be part of NATO or they have a formal relationship with NATO?
I think it's very important. You know, we committed to the sovereignty and security of Ukraine in the 1995 Budapest Memorandum. The British, the United States, and Russia committed to Ukraine's security and sovereignty if they would give up their nuclear weapons. None of those three countries have honored that pledge. The only way to reliably commit the United States to the defense of another country is a defense treaty with consent to ratification by the United States Senate. And I think anything short of that, the Ukrainians won't trust and actually shouldn't trust.
Yes, they've had declarations by by Russia rather, in past years, and I can't imagine that another one would enjoy great credibility in Kyiv. Do you think NATO is ready to embrace Ukraine as a country which, if attacked by Russia once again, or harassed in the east, or whatever it might be, would receive military support, actual military presence in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think so. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said yesterday that NATO's beginning the conversation about that. And it's a conversation that's going to take a fair amount of time and a lot of public debate in all 30 NATO countries. And it should, right? Because it's a sacred obligation coming to the defense of another country and saying that an attack on someone else will be treated the same as an attack on your own country. Moreover, there are standards for admission to NATO: no contested borders, civilian control of the military, a public defense budget, and anti-corruption measures that Ukraine is going to have to, after it wins this war, give the NATO countries confidence that it is abiding by, making progress towards. So it will take a while. But yes, I do actually think that what Ukraine has demonstrated in their stalwart defense of their own country is what a fabulous addition they would be to the NATO family. and how much safer the rest of us would be by adding Ukraine's people, Ukraine's military, and Ukraine's territory into the NATO bargain.
Kori, Schake, thanks. And I'm going to call back our other panelists as well, David Ignatius and Bill Taylor. I'd like to see everyone now. And I'd like to hear, first of all, just briefly, a minute or two at most, what you have to say about what you've heard from your fellow panelists, starting with David Ignatius. David?
Well, it's wonderful to hear both Bill Taylor and Kori Schake, who I respect, really leading thinkers on this. I think the question of what victory looks like is a complicated one. I think Ambassador Taylor made reference to that. President Biden has said that he believes that this war should end in a negotiated settlement. And I think that President Biden is probably right in that. He argues that we need to do everything we can to give Ukraine the maximum leverage. Ukraine wants to have all Russian troops out of its territory, as Bill Taylor said. I hope that's possible. But I think the idea of unconditional victory, unconditional surrender by Russia of the sort that Nazi Germany and Japan made in 1945 is unrealistic. Unconditional surrender by a nuclear country is, I don't think, is in prospect. So, short of unconditional surrender, you're talking about a negotiated settlement. On the question of escalation, I think Kori Schake was right to credit President Biden for thinking carefully about the commitments the United States makes and the need to avoid World War III. She's more critical than I would be about the way he's exercised restraint. I'm struck by how Biden, starting from this base of we're not going to have World War III, has consistently added the weapons that Ukraine needs, and Ukraine's success on the battlefield is a measure of America's strong support, not simply in providing weapons, but in organizing this coalition. Without American leadership, the coalition that is backing Ukraine so vigorously wouldn't exist. So, I credit that. I think we are entering now a crucial phase of the war, and I think that Kori Schake and Bill Taylor would argue, and I would join them in saying that we may need to step up the level of our assistance. This year may shape the balance of the conflict, and it's crucial that Putin fail. And I note a final word. We've talked, as we often do in these discussions, about how poorly the Russian military has done. But whenever I talk to Ukrainian commanders in Ukraine, I hear genuine concern about Russian reserves of manpower. These may be untrained troops. Sometimes they may be convicts fighting with the Wagner militia. But wave after wave, as people say, at some point, mass begins to equal real power. And I think the Ukrainians are concerned about the Russians continuing to press them. So I think we need to think about ways we augment Ukrainian power as they face this continuing Russian onslaught attempt to break through.
Certainly a lot of history to Russia using the numbers of its troops as what it builds its strategy around, its tactics around. Bill Taylor, thoughts about what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
So I certainly agree with Kori Schake when she says that we need to provide more weapons and not just more weapons, but heavier, longer range, and in volumes that allow the Ukrainians to do what we have talked about doing, that is break through the Russian lines. We saw this, Robert. We saw this rout of Russian troops up in Kharkiv, where Russian troops panicked not well trained. They panicked. They dropped their weapons, got out of their tanks, and went on back to got bicycles, heading back to the border. So we know it can happen. What the Ukrainians need, we've talked about. I mean, they need the ability to mount this offensive and to do it soon. Because Kori's right. I mean, the current level of mobilization that Putin has tried to bring about has not succeeded. I mean, he's been able to scrape the barrel, but and he's got 140 million Russians, and there are less than 40 million Ukrainians. So the numbers do speak. There's no doubt about that. Which means that the Ukrainians need to move now. The Ukrainians need to move now so that the Russians don't have the time. Ukrainians need to take the time away from the Russians, and they can do that. So I think that's right. And on the NATO question, I totally agree. NATO would be much stronger with Ukraine in it, and it will take time. It will take time. It turns out, by the way, that there's no prohibition in the treaty.
This is something that I learned from you the other day. Kori, you mentioned that NATO won't admit a member with contested borders. Not so, you say.
Not so. Well, and we know this because look at East Germany, West Germany. West Germany was a member of NATO in very good standing, and East Germany was dominated by, and that border was, not militarily contested, but contested. And it's not in the treaty. There is, Kori's exactly right. There's a NATO paper. There's a NATO policy. There's not in law anywhere in the treaty where that says they shouldn't have border disputes. But nonetheless, Ukraine could definitely join. They won't join during the war. That's clear. There's not. The war will have to end. Kori also is right when she says after the victory. It's not after the war. It's after the victory. After the victory, then there can be movement on the part of both NATO to have this conversation and on the part of Ukraine to get ready to join. So I think that's an important one because Ukraine needs security after the victory. If no matter how this ends, and I think it will end sooner than David does. But however it ends, Ukraine, the Russians will be back. They won't give up on trying to dominate Ukraine. And so they need security either of NATO or they need, like we've given Israel, the ability to defend themselves, to deter another attack by having the best weapons in the region.
And Kori, Schake, comments on what you've heard.
Just 2 points to add to the very smart things already said by David and Bill. And one is about mass. I think we need to be careful not to mythologize the Russian willingness to kill a bunch of Russians to achieve their objectives. The most interesting thing I learned when I was in Kyiv in September was the Ukrainian military expressing their mystification that the Russians had no capacity to do reconnaissance, right? They had no equivalent of cavalry. They had no ability to figure out where the Ukrainian units were. And what you can see Russia doing now with these human waves of troops is they still don't have reconnaissance. What they are doing is using these prisoners or poorly trained troops to figure out where the Ukrainian units are and then using artillery to strike those units. The Wagner Group is actually now failing to be able to recruit prisoners out of prisons because the word has filtered back that only 20% of them have survived their experience in Ukraine. So it's not clear to me that mass is going to work in the way, this isn't the Battle of Stalingrad. The second thing I would say is about escalation. I think we actually need to brace ourselves that the risk of escalation is going to increase substantially as Ukraine wins this war. Russia is going to get more desperate. My nightmare is Vladimir Putin concluding that as the Russian army gets pushed off of Ukrainian territory to have a nuclear strike on Kyiv to be able to try and claim that they achieved the regime change. They went there to effect, and therefore that's why the army's coming home. Again, what I was struck by talking to Ukrainians in the fall was when I asked, how nervous are you? How are you thinking about this issue? To a person, civil society, business people, government people's response was, it will not change the outcome of the war. It will simply increase the cost. And we ought actually to be as brave in facing this risk as Ukrainians, who are the direct people threatened by it, are being.
Let me put a question that one of our attendees, an anonymous one, has submitted, which is, this person writes, given that Putin seems to have staked his reputation and his life, I would say, on the outcome of the war, the questioner writes, what do you think he will do if it becomes clear even to him that he is losing the war? Well, Kori, Schake, you've just given us the worst possible, I suppose, course he could take if he's convinced of that, which would be a tactical nuke in spite for spite. What else? What would can Vladimir Putin, Bill Taylor? Do you think he can survive an undisputed defeat in Ukraine, in power?
I think it's possible, Robert. I think it's possible. I don't think this is existential for him. It may be that if he loses, as Kori and I both projected, that he's out of power one way or the other. That is possible. It doesn't have to be. He's got ways to stay in power. And this is not existential to Russia. This is existential to Ukraine. It's not existential to Russia. We don't know what would happen in the Kremlin if he lost. Maybe he could tough it out. I share Kori's nightmare. I think it's very unlikely. I think there could be people in the Russian chain of command who might say no in that time. So I think it's very, very unlikely. But he could stick it out.
And David Ignatius, in your piece about your interview with Secretary of State, you remarked that the Russians seem to be holding back a certain amount of not just nuclear weaponry, but other sophisticated weaponry, on the assumption that and I believe Blinken told you the false assumption that there's a war to come between Russia and NATO, or that Russia must be prepared for a war with NATO. Do you foresee? Do you think that that's the way Putin sees this, as a this is just the Spanish Civil War. The real thing happens next.
Well, he should be concerned about that. He has enormous American and NATO firepower surrounding him, with the likely addition of Finland and Sweden to NATO. He has a kind of nightmare scenario for a man who thought he'd redraw the security map of Europe in his favor. He's getting the opposite. So I think he is holding some forces in reserve, obviously strategic forces. I've been struck, whether it's incapacity or something else, that there has not been the kind of massive strategic bombing of Kyiv that the Russians certainly would be capable of. What is he holding that in reserve for? There's not been as strong an effort to decapitate the leadership. If you visit Kyiv, if you go to the presidential administration, it's sandbagged, but it's it could be under fire daily in a way that it's not. I just want to briefly make a comment about what both Kori and Bill Taylor have mentioned about Ukraine's future in NATO. I think that is to be shaped in discussions once the war is over with Ukrainian victory. I hope you're right, but in the future. But what's crucial for the immediate future, before this NATO accession happens, is Ukraine's ability to deter any future Russian attack, any Russian attempt to resume the war, to fight back and retake what they feel they lost. And that requires Ukraine to have a level of weapons modern fighters, for example, a full complement of tanks, artilleries, long-range rockets. And that should be done long before Ukraine is a member of NATO. NATO is about the guarantee that we will go to war with our troops to protect them. But short of that, giving them much stronger firepower to prevent any next time, I think is crucial. And I hope that starts right away.
I'd like to ask the three of you who've been pretty relatively hopeful to extremely bullish about Ukraine's prospects in the war, to think worst case for a moment here, which is the United States and our allies are in pretty deep in supporting the Ukrainian forces by arming them and by training them. Imagine for a moment that things don't go well, that Russians actually either start bombing Kyiv and other cities with more powerful ordnance, or something in the battlefield changes. What happens if the Ukrainian army were to be in retreat and appear to be in weak shape? Does the U.S. threaten Russia? Does it go to the United Nations? What's our fallback in case this doesn't turn into a Ukrainian battlefield victory, or is even thinking the thought demoralizing? Kori, Schake, what should we be thinking?
I think you should always think about bad outcomes, right? Any good strategist is always worried a trap door is going to open underneath them. And that's how you shape events so that it doesn't. I think if the Ukrainian military were to break, which again, I do not think likely, I think what you would see is an insurgency against Russian occupation that would bleed the Russian forces terribly and would make control of the country impossible. So while that is happening, I think the Biden administration would dramatically ramp up sanctions on Russia. They would ramp up political pressure on Russia. But again, military force is what's going to solve this problem one way or another. And I think what was for me so illuminating about the NATO debate about providing tanks is that felt to me like the moment that Aristotle talks about as anagnoresis, right? The moment of realization that we actually weren't going to let Ukraine lose this. Mm-hmm. That we were going to provide what it would take, even if it means you reconstitute the Ukrainian army in Poland and Romania and arm it for recovering their country. I think we're in for all of that. That is, we have committed for all of that at this point.
Bill Taylor, what do you think when you think the worst case here?
So I would agree with Kori. And I would reinforce the point that the Ukrainians will fight. They will fight. They will continue to fight. I mean, the scenario you described, Robert, of the Ukrainian military breaking, I'm not sure what that looks like. But what I do know is that even if they fall back, even if they retreat in certain places, or they retreat to the other side of the river that kind of goes down kind of the middle of the country, they will continue to fight. And we will continue to support them. We will continue to support the government of Ukraine. That kind of support, I think, would continue across the borders. And I think in the end, with the other pressures that Kori just described, the political, economic, in the end, Ukraine will win that scenario as well.
And David Ignatius, your plan for the worst case?
So I think in the worst case of a total Russian breakout, we would revert, as both Bill and Kori have suggested, to what was originally our strategy. It was the expectation, I think, within the Biden administration, was that Russia might quickly appear to gain control in Ukraine, take Kyiv, take over the leadership, install some puppet, but the porcupine strategy, an indigestible Ukraine where people fought every inch of territory, Russian occupation was intolerable. The cost daily would increase. That was the way we were thinking the war might go. That would come back into play. I don't think that's going to happen. Just to introduce one final quick thought. So the worst happening, I think, would be for Russia to escalate vertically. I don't think they're not going to get to Kyiv, but they could use tactical nuclear weapons. And what scares me is, from what little the administration has said, obviously they leave their options open, but you get the sense that our reaction might not be to escalate into nuclear space, but to respond with very powerful tactical conventional weapons, not nuclear. And the problem with that is that the red line against use of nuclear weapons will have been breached. And I think it's very much in our interest that this war not get to that point. It's crucial. If a world where nuclear weapons are used is a different world. So I believe that to others and there.
But are you saying that the deterrent to Russia doing that should be the threat that nuclear weapons will be used against you, Mr. Putin?
I don't think that. I think we should do everything we can to prevent Russia from escalating. So I think getting the Germans to speak to Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping to convey to Putin powerfully, we don't believe that nuclear weapons are appropriate. I think that was really important. I think the Indians doing that was important. I think, consensus about that puts limits, bounds on that is powerfully in our national interest.
Well, I'm sorry after such an upbeat discussion to have brought us to the end of this most bleak consideration of the future. But thanks to all of you for taking part, Ambassador William Taylor, Dr. Kori, Schake, David Ignatius. Thanks for being our panel today. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout and Ronnie Giuliano and Adrian Kiss of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization which represents in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva, which is in Greater Tel Aviv. The website for the group is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.